here's the outline. I'm going to briefly cover some historical issues and then talk some about neurobiology, try to not get too complex with that, then get down to what some of the therapeutic potential and dangers are, and then talk a little bit about going forward in the future. One of the things that has struck me about, as I've been learning about this, is how as it says on the slide, trying to separate the science and the evidence on the one hand from the emotion on the second hand, and then a third hand of politics creates a lot of confusion. And so I'm sure you're reading a whole lot about this. There's a lot in the newspapers and the media. There are an enormous amount of opinions, and just as a caveat ahead of time, you're going to hear a lot of extreme positions. And the question to ask, number one, is what's the evidence behind the extreme position that you're hearing? And number two, where is the spokesperson coming from? Because people have an axe to grind in this, and they will sometimes selectively pick up evidence to try to make their point. So it's nice to know what point they're trying to make so you can get a sense of some of the distortions that go on. It's very hard to get an undistorted view in this. But the fundamental thing that I keep coming back to, and there's so many of these things, the more I read about it, the more puzzled I get, is how is it that something that has a medication that was used for millennia, as long as recorded time, this substance has been used. And it was a mainstream medication in Western Europe, in this country, for well over 100 years. And what happened that disappeared from medical practice, and why is it coming back now in this very controversial form? So I'll try to answer that question, but I won't succeed. But at least I'll tell you some of the things that have been going on. So I'm going to start off by sort of exemplifying some of the different extremes in this. And I'll start off with what I think is a traditional scientific point of view. One of my medical heroes is William Osler. We have a road named after him out here. He is about as traditional and conventional a physician as could be. And he is somebody who is no great fan of medication. And as you can see from the first quote here, he was very cautious about using it. But on the other hand, he felt very strongly that cannabis was the best medication for migraine headaches. And he had kind of the standard textbook of the time, and in every edition of that textbook from 1892 to 1915, that was in there. I won't go through all the other conventional citations to try to make the point that this was mainstream medicine for a long time. I have the other extreme on my next slide, which I frankly am not going to read because I find it too troubling, but I want you to read it, because when you read some of the things being said right now by Attorney General Sessions that purport to be fact about the dangers of marijuana, it seems extreme. But things get even more extreme behind that. So there's lots of things that go on politically behind closed doors. And in some ways, that's a blessing that's behind closed doors. You don't want to know what goes on there. But some of those doors got opened, and as you may know, some of the tapes, Richard Nixon's tapes, got released to the public. And there's some really awful things in there. And one of them relates to marijuana. So here's a 1971 selection from his tapes. So again, this is just give you a flavor of some of the irrational and emotional issues that get stirred up around this substance. The third thing I'm going to show you in terms of rationality comes up to the present. And this is a scientist who I'm going to show you a brief video. It's on YouTube. It's an hour documentary about this gentleman who is he's an internationally renowned figure, may one day get the Nobel Prize, just about completely unknown in this country, which is, to me, just one of the, just another example of the blanket of ignorance that the medical profession and the clinical profession has been covered by, so that so much of the knowledge and research and scholarship about this substance is being done in Europe because it can't be done here. Here is a text, Handbook of Cannabis, of extremely impressive scholarship, almost all of which is being done in Europe because you can't do it here. So this is the guy that started it all. And you're going to go ahead and...
Are you ready?
I'm just going to show you a 2-minute clip out of this in the hope that you'll be inspired to go on your own and watch this whole video.
One of the topics that I decided to work on was the chemistry of the plant Cannabis sativa. Cannabis had been used for thousands of years, both as a drug as a recreational agent, but surprisingly, the active compound was never isolated in pure form. I decided, together with my colleague Yechiel Gaoni, to go and do research and find out what are the compounds present in cannabis, and particularly what is the active compounds present there. Well, a scientist should try to find topics of importance. And I thought that this is a topic of importance. I knew that the police have a lot of cannabis, hashish, that's being smuggled from the Lebanon, and after all the legal things were completed, they usually burn it. I was at the Weizmann Institute at that time, a very young person. I went to the director of the Weizmann Institute, the administrative director, and asked him, do you know anybody in the police who can supply hashish to us for research? So he called one of his friends, can you supply cannabis to one of our researchers? And I hear from the other side somebody shouting, is he, meaning me, is he reliable? And the administrative director, who actually almost didn't know me, said, yes, of course he's reliable. Let him come over and pick some hashish. I went over, they didn't have a car, took a bus, got 5 kilos of hashish, went on the bus, and people in the bus after 15, 20 minutes just started asking, what the hell is this smell? Very unusual smell. I mean, I had 5 kilos of hashish in my bag going around.
But I guess you're the only person in the world that took 5 kilos of hashish from the police and got away with it.
Well, probably yes. It turned out that the police were not allowed to give us...
So you get a sense of who this guy is. He's a down-to-earth scientist who's still today trying to work on this. So he was the one who first identified THC as the active component, and he discovered the whole endocannabinoid system. And I'll get onto a little bit of that. And here's where you can, if you want to see the whole thing, just on YouTube and look up the scientist. So here's where we start getting into some of the complexities. Cannabis actually has 60 different cannabinoids in it, but we really only focused on 2 of them. One is THC, which is the primary psychoactive agent, and you can see in different parts of the plant there are different percentage concentrations, and that makes an impact, or has a huge impact on the effect on people. Cannabidiol is something. How many people here have heard of cannabidiol or CBD? That's terrific. And recently, as a year ago, when I would ask groups about it, no hands would go up. in a professional group. And the public was much more aware of this than the professionals were, but this is a substance of great interest, and there's a lot of curiosities about it. It is in the cannabis plant, which is Schedule 1. This is not an addictive agent. In fact, it seems to be a counter-addictive. It counters some of the effects of THC. But nevertheless, the DEA has insisted on keeping this as a Schedule 1. I know this is a source of some confusion because more and more people are buying or think they're buying CBD in stores and online, and they're using it. I can tell you, those of our patients who are using it, their urines are coming up positive for THC. So one of the things we'll get back to is all of this non-pharmaceutical preparations are not regulated, and people don't really know what they're buying. But the other important thing about these two is that these two are in inverse proportion in a plant, in a given strain. So if you have a strain that's high in THC, it's going to be low in CBD, and vice versa, and that there are all kinds of implications from that we could get into later. So again, in terms of historical use, it's been used for medicine as long as time has been recorded. So the notion that this is somehow a new agent is just wild. Used as medication for millennia in other parts of the world. Didn't come into Western medicine until the 19th or 20th century. It was used in the 19th and 20th century, and for almost 100 years, it was listed in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia with other medications. And it was produced by all the major pharmaceutical companies, not as a raw plant, but as a fluid extract. And this, in one slide, again, there are books about how all this happened, and I'll be glad to share that with folks. But in one slide, this summarizes 35 years of one man's work. Harry Enslinger was the first head of what is now the DEA, and he devoted his life, much of his life, to locking up what he called marijuana, what we call cannabis. Cannabis, by the way, was the traditional word for this medication, for this substance. Around the turn of the beginning of the 19th century, it began to be brought in from, among other places, Mexico, and there was a slang word, which was marijuana. But if you look at DSM-5, we talk about cannabis use disorder, and the recommendation to professionals is to use the word cannabis. Just like when we treat opioid use disorders, we don't refer to it as dope, and when we treat alcoholics, we don't refer to it as booze. So I try to use the cannabis word when we're talking professionally, but I'll slip. So anyway, what he did in a series of acts basically locked it up. So what had been mainstream medication that was known by physicians for years got taken away, not because it was being overutilized. We're having an opiate epidemic now. We had an opiate epidemic in the 1880s, 1890s, after the invention of the hypodermic needle and the introduction of heroin, which was supposed to be a non-addictive alternative to morphine. And that set off a tremendous set of problems that we're seeing the same thing now. But heroin was taken off the market, but opioids were never removed from practice. But cannabis was. And without going through all the details of this, the worst part of it was 1970, where as part of the Controlled Substances Act, it was classified as Schedule 1, and I'll talk later about why that's a terrible problem. This is how it was in 1970 when it was Scheduled 1. This was how it happened. The Assistant Secretary of Health said, this is a very complex substance, and we just don't know about it. But fortunately, we have all these studies that are being done, and so we're going to temporarily put this into Schedule 1 until these study results are available to us. Well, the studies were never completed. So what was supposed to be a temporary limbo has become permanent lock. And again, that explains to me a lot of some of the confusion and disagreement about this, because we just can't get the facts. about this complex substance. So speaking of effects, let me go through the neurobiology. I'll try to make this as simple as possible. I won't get into too many details with it, but here is just a timeline of some of the studies. And again, if people take notes, I'll be glad to supply these the slides if anybody wants it. Let me just point out a couple things. That cannabidiol, CBD, has been around since 1940. So it's not like it's a brand new substance, even though people are just now getting to know about it. On the other hand, THC was not isolated until Michelin did that in 1964. Now we know that that morphine was the activation in the opium poppy around the early 1800s. We know the activation in the coca plant, cocaine. We knew that around 1900, but THC, we didn't know what it was that was active in the plant. And part of that is a technical issue. It turns out that THC is a fairly complicated lipid, which makes its isolation identification technically problematic. But the point is, again, we were operating, even when it was a mainstream medication, we were operating in the dark with the active agent for a long time. One of the points that Michelin makes in the video is that he felt that CBD was demonstrated to be an anticonvulsant back in 1981. This is still being actively debated, but this again, it's been around so long that's just coming up. That things have been around for a long time, and there's still debate about them. And then you can see, just it's been relatively recently. I was certainly at a medical school before the endocannabinoid system was discovered, and I can tell you, I made a point in making sure that the endocannabinoid system is being taught to medical students at Georgetown. We just had our lecture on that this week. I cannot find another medical school where this is being taught. So this ignorance just keeps perpetuating. The timeline said that we actually have receptors identified. The CB, so it's cannabinoid 1, cannabinoid 2. The CB1 receptor is the most common receptor in the central nervous system. So we're not talking about some obscure receptor. It is very present. We know that receptor is the one that gets activated by the psychoactive effects. We also know that there are no CB1 receptors in the brainstem. And because of that, there's never been a recorded death of overdose by CB1 because the respiratory centers are not affected by this. It's in some other places. The CB2 is mostly outside the nervous system, but it is extremely active in so many systems, which I'll show you briefly. Both of these act in the inhibitory transmission, synaptic transmission, and we think there are a whole lot of other receptors, but they haven't been characterized yet. So we're really, again, we keep coming back to how little we know about something that's been around for so long. There are 2 internal ligands that have now been identified, and we know a lot about them. I won't get into the detail of that, but we are learning more and more about those. And I said that the cannabinoid system affects multiple systems, and here's a list of some of the things that are affected by this very widespread system throughout the body. And these last 2 slides, this is a text. I'll show you a cartoon of it in a moment. But the point of this is that these ligands that I mentioned, they're technically referred to as neuromodulators rather than neurotransmitters. I won't go into the details unless people are interested later about the difference of that. What's interesting about this is that it has retrograde signaling. It works backwards compared to the usual transmitters, and that it interacts with the opioid system. Let me show you a picture that might make that clearer. Ordinarily, if this is the presynaptic nerve, usually what you've got are neurotransmitters that are released into the cleft, and then they activate the postsynaptic nerve. What happens with the cannabinoid ligands is they're synthesized here, and they migrate backwards, and the receptor is actually up there on the presynaptic. And once that gets activated, it then acts on it inhibits both the inhibitory system, the GABA system, and the stimulating system, the glutamate system. So it's been, one of the descriptions I like is it's like the oil in a car engine. It just makes things move smoothly. It has all kinds of subtle effects. Again, coming back to how complex this is and how central it is in the workings of our brain. Again, I didn't want to belabor this, but if anybody's interested in this side of it, I can point you in directions, and there's a lot of information out there. So, but with the core of what I wanted to talk about is what are the therapeutic potentials of this, and what are the dangers of it? Because that is what is being so widely debated. When we talk about what the impact is, part of the confusion is we're talking about two systems. Remember, I said that before it got taken out of our hands, it was a pharmaceutical made by pharmaceutical companies by a high-quality regulated system. But what we're talking about today in the state of Maryland and many other states is it's a very different system. It's not a pharmaceutical system. So, for example, what is being sold in the dispensaries are raw plants, as opposed to a pharmaceutical company will either synthesize or extract the substance. And they have standards, they have government standards, which don't exist for the medical marijuana. Medical marijuana it's smoked, it's eaten, it's topical, but the pharmaceutical is always oral. The medical is actually still Schedule 1. So, and that creates all kinds of problems, because when the states legalize it, they can't change the federal law. There is a clause in the Constitution called the Supremacy Clause, which says that when there's a conflict between a state law and the federal law holds. So everything that's being done on a state level to legalize marijuana or cannabis has no bearing on the federal law, and that's where Jeff Sessions comes in. And we won't get into a whole lot of this, but there was a lot of quandary about what to do about this discrepancy. And midway through the Obama administration, Eric Holder promulgated a policy that if a state is well regulated, if they pass a law well regulated, the federal government was not going to spend any effort or money prosecuting that. Well, several months ago, and there was a memo, a famous memo called the Cole Memo. It took a while to finally come to this compromise. Well, Sessions has thrown that memo out, and he is saying that he now is going to possibly come in and prosecute all those states that have legalized marijuana on a state basis. And what's going to happen with that is really yet to be determined. That's one of the interesting future pieces. But that is the legal quandary that a lot of people are struggling with. So, but on the other hand, the pharmaceutical version are Schedule 2 and Schedule 3. So they're legal to prescribe. The other difference is that a physician can prescribe the pharmaceutical, write a prescription, take it to the pharmacy. They cannot prescribe medical marijuana or medical cannabis because it's illegal under federal law. So the physician can simply recommend it. And when this first broke, back when California was the first state to allow this, the federal government took umbrage on it and said any physician who even recommended it, the DEA was going to pull their DEA license. They didn't, in fact, do that. But they threatened to do that, and legally they could do that if they want to do that. So, and then finally the source. I'm sure just reading the papers you've seen how politicized the process has become of people who are applying to be growers, applying to be processors, applying to be dispensaries, and all kinds of political considerations come in. When this was first brought up, actually the Secretary of Health for the state of Maryland was Steve Sharfstein's son, Josh. And Josh didn't like this. And so he tried to delay it, but and the basis on which he was going to delay it was it was going to cost a lot of money to set up this whole separate system where we already had an in-place system where there's a pharmaceutical company that meets FDA regulations, and it's dispensed by pharmacies that are all around, that are highly regulated. Why replicate that? That was his argument, but it ended up happening. Anyway, so we have this parallel system. So I'll go through some of the pharmaceuticals that are out there. A lot of people don't even know that there is pharmaceutical cannabis out there. And these are the two FDA-approved substances. One's called Dronabinol, Marinol is the brand name, and the other is a Navalone known as Sesamet. They're almost the same thing. I think that the Sesamet people didn't bother. When it first came out, it was Schedule 2. After a while, the Marinol people said they applied to the FDA to be moved from Schedule 2 to Schedule 3. And I think the Sesamet people just haven't bothered to go through that trouble. But it's relatively low regulation. And it's approved for these specific purposes, FDA approved. But people like Meshaloom say, wait a second, you have this complex substance that's got 60 cannabinoids in it, and you're going to pull one substance out, either synthesize it, and but the power of this substance, the therapeutic power, doesn't come from any one agent. It comes from the interaction between a number of agents. So they call it the AntiRaja Effect, that all these things acting together. And there is one agent that we don't yet have, but it's out there to try to take advantage of this. So there's a pharmaceutical company in Britain called GW Pharmaceuticals that doesn't synthesize this. They grow cannabis plants under such strict, careful conditions that they can create a botanical form of a substance which it's called, I didn't put Nabiximol is the generic name, I should have put that up there, but Sativex is the brand name. It's a one-to-one mixture of CBD and THC, and comes out as a spray. It's been approved in 28 countries, including Canada, and we can't get it in this country. It's been fast-tracked by the FDA for almost 4 years now. So frustrating. There's another a CBD pharmaceutical called, the brand name is Epidiolex, that is also being considered, but it's being used in and there's usually you see this in the business section, because every time a trial fails or succeeds, the stock of these companies go up and down. But it's something that hopefully we'll be able to get, if nothing else, to do research on. And then there are all the non-pharmaceuticals that I've been referring to, and that's what is commonly considered to be medical cannabis, and what is coming through all these, the growers and the dispensers. And it just doesn't have, they all have regulatory language, but nobody knows how well it's in fact being regulated. And the anecdotal stories that I've heard, when scientists go in and actually buy the stuff that's out there and analyze it, it doesn't turn out to be what it's supposed to be. So there's a legitimate cannabis researcher at Hopkins called named Ryan Vandry, who's gone out to Colorado and bought up a lot of the medical cannabis that's being sold there, and it has to be carefully labeled as to what percent it has of THC. And when he brings it back to his lab and analyzes it, there's no connection between what's on the label and what's actually in there, and they find contaminants and all kinds of other things. I haven't been to the dispensaries here, but I go to the dispensary out in Washington State. It's got relatives out there, and they're fairly well developed. And if you go into a dispensary, if the ones that are here are like that, what you'll meet are these salespeople are very confident and very polished, and they'll tell you about all the nuanced differences and the different percentage of THC or CBT in these different strains. So they sound good, but I have some concern about what's actually there when you start measuring more objectively. So where do you go for a definitive answer? And this is as close as we get. And fortunately, this is a relatively new 2017. It came out in January of 2017. I'll give you more slides about this. This is the National Academy of Sciences. It used to be National Academy of Sciences, but now they call it Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And they did an exhaustive study of just what are the pros and what are the cons based on the evidence available. So I recommend this to you. This is actually the third time this group has done it, which I wasn't so clear about. They did it in 82, they did it in 99. This document, you can buy it at this website for $70 or $80, but you can download it, the whole thing, and just read it right there. Now, it is 487 pages, but pages 13 to 22, if you don't have it in you to read all, it has it all summarized in those 9 pages. So I do have to tell you that it gets somewhat confusing, and I'll show you why. The way they put it is, well, it gets a little confusing, but let me show you some of the things that they say. So they talk about the therapeutic effectiveness, and this is, again, a condensation even of those 10 pages. They say there's conclusive or substantial evidence that it is effective in chronic pain, antiemetics, in chemotherapy, and the spasticity of multiple sclerosis. There's moderate evidence that it has some short-term improved sleep outcomes, short-term with specific conditions. And then there's limited evidence about it's being useful. For example, increased appetite in HIV/AIDS. It's approved by the FDA for that. And yet, these people found that the evidence for the effectiveness is just limited. Tourette's syndrome, limited. There's a lot of interest in, is this helpful for anxiety or PTSD? I thought about taking these pieces off this slide because the positives, which are limited, are so small. You can see for PTSD, there's one small fair quality study.
And in Baltimore, in Maryland, PTSD is one of the conditions allowed by the Maryland law for which you can get this.
Yeah, and then just getting into the politics of it, when the Maryland Commission, when the recommendations came out from the commission, the Cannabis Commission, they were allowed to do commentary. And one of the commentaries, they went to the Medical Society for commentary. And I was asked to do the commentary for the Medical Society, and I got together with some other people, and we responded that that of the 5 things that they had recommended, one of them was PTSD. And our response was that there is not sufficient evidence for PTSD, and that should be taken off of the recommendation because the evidence wasn't there. Well, it stayed in. And I asked somebody on the commission later why that didn't get taken out. And they said they were swamped with so many comments that they basically didn't take any of them into account. So that's, again, where you have the conflict between politics, and there's just enormous pressure on this commission, and science and evidence. So PTSD is right at the crosshairs because PTSD is such a hot issue at this point. There's so little in the way of medication for it, And so I think there's a lot of leaning to try to find anything that might be hopeful. So the striking thing about this, once you sort that out, is they say there's the evidence that it's helpful, but here are all the conditions where there is insufficient evidence. That doesn't mean it's not helpful, but it means that the research you need to document that it's helpful is lacking. So even with epilepsy, so here is Mechelen saying that he's demonstrated since 1981 that CBD was helpful for it, but these folks are saying now the evidence, what they regard as substantial evidence, is not there. Spasticity from multiple sclerosis, yes, but not from spinal cord injury. PTSD, no. Anxiety, no. Sleep, no. And yet that's the one, and certainly my patients will come to me telling me about how helpful this has been for any of these things. But again, my patients are not conducting randomly controlled double-blind studies. They're just anecdotal. So what about the dangers? What about the other side? They speak to that. Again, in the same terms, substantial evidence, moderate evidence, or insufficient evidence. And without going through all those details, I just wanted to hit the ones for which they say there is substantial evidence. Lower birth rates in women who were, of the babies and women who were smoking. Worse respiratory symptoms, not cancer, but bronchitis. This is a really hot one that I think is obviously relevant to here, and that's there's clearly a strong association between the use of cannabis and acute psychosis, where it triggers it. Whether it can be considered causative of psychosis or schizophrenia, that is still up in the air, but there's clearly an association. And then clearly it's related to increased motor vehicle crashes. I'll say a little bit more about that. So these are the findings from here, but there's a lot of other findings out there that I'm going to just quickly refer to about in terms of safety. I'd already mentioned that there are no overdose deaths. Intoxication is a problem, and I'll talk a bit more about the impaired driving. How addictive is it? You'll hear people say there's no addictive danger at all. Other extreme are people say it's a gateway drug and it's as bad as heroin. It actually is addictive, but at a level equal to the benzodiazepines and somewhere around half as addictive as alcohol. The cognitive deficits, we'll mention some detail about that. And with fetal development, this study said it is not sufficient, but there have been some recent studies, maybe more recent than they considered, showing that in the early couple of years there's no impact on cognitive development, but there's evidence of after the age of 3, when they can measure certain factors, there may be some evidence of of retarded development in kids whose mothers smoke regularly. So drug driving is another complex issue. Turns out that cannabis and alcohol affect motor performance in different ways, and specifically, cannabis affects what we call our automatic functions, whereas alcohol affects the more complex tasks. What cannabis users are able to do is they're aware they're impaired and they make adjustments. Alcohol people don't. When you mix alcohol with cannabis, you start blocking the ability of the cannabis user to make the adjustments. So if you just look at the rate of danger, increased danger of accidents with cannabis is something like in the range of 3 to 4%, 3 to 4 times normal. Alcohol impairment is more like 5 to 7. But the tricky part is if you have a little bit of cannabis and a little bit of alcohol, you get a greater impairment than a lot of either one. And that makes me particularly troubled when I watch some of the ads these days in California for vineyards that advertise, come up here and have a little wine and smoke a little pot and combine them, that's going to be very difficult. And the whole issue of how you measure impaired driving, I won't go into the details, but we have a blood level for alcohol. They're trying to use a blood level for cannabis, but because it lasts so long, it's hard to, we know that with alcohol, there's more impairment on the up limb than there is on the down limb. And we think it's the same with cannabis, but you can't connect the impairment with the blood levels as easily. And then there's the whole delayed effect. And this is a study which I emphasized, 1985. There's a lack of these studies about the delayed effect. So we know something about the acute effect. And this was a small study, but it was well done, published in the APA journal. They took licensed pilots. They put them in a simulator. They got a flight simulator. They got a baseline. Then they gave them one kind of a cigarette with a measured amount. They got high. And then the next day, 24 hours later, when they were no longer high, they put them in the simulator. And number one, they were still impaired, but number two, they didn't know it. So there's a whole question of, because cannabis is around so long, about the delayed effects. So this is one of the really unsolved issues as this substance becomes more available, how we're going to deal with this. This is another study which I thought was pretty impressive. It didn't ring the bell for the National Academy of Sciences piece, but they did a prospective study of people who were using on an ongoing basis. If they used before the age of 18 and did it heavily, which was generally defined as at least once a week, prospectively, these people had cognitive deficits that need to be reversed. And that's clearly a great concern. If people began after the age of 18, they didn't find this. But still, again, it might be a situation where there is deficits, we just can't measure them at this point.
And currently about 31 to 33% of high schoolers are using cannabis.
Yeah, I didn't put a slide in here, but there's something called Monitoring the Future, which is a terrific study of the utilization of substances by teenagers. And what's been interesting for the past 5 years, even though cannabis has been more available, cannabis use has been declining in high school kids. January, that decline finally began to reverse, which makes sense. It just wouldn't make sense that there was less all this year. So that's troubling also as they use more. Cannabis withdrawal, talking about dangers, we do know that there is a physical withdrawal syndrome. It actually got memorialized in the DSM-5. Generally, it's becoming more significant now because we're finding higher percentage of THC. But for us, clinically, there's a persistent craving that lasts for weeks and weeks and can trigger relapses. There's almost no literature about what to do about this, but there is one study done by high-quality people at Columbia where they are using synthetic THC as a detoxification agent. On one hand, they found that there were reduced symptoms. In the short run, it worked. In the long run, it didn't seem to make a difference in outcomes. And there's one other study done with the Bixenol of Sativex that I mentioned before that found the same thing. We are starting to use this ourselves. It's too early to tell about the long term, but certainly in the short term, we are finding that people are more comfortable when we use this medication, and we only use it in fairly extreme situations. Going forward, I won't spend a lot of time here. Medical cannabis, you could see that this state sort of became the state that took the longest from passing a law to actual implementation, but is now with us, and here's something about the process. If you have questions about this, the Maryland Cannabis Commission, which has gone through its own roiling and changes, has an excellent website where they have frequently asked questions and updates. We talked about the physician has to register, the patient has to register, then the patient goes to the physician, gets a recommendation, and then the patient takes that recommendation, goes to the dispensary, and gets the medication. There was such a backlog, and it takes so long to grow it, that when they opened the dispensaries, they were depleted pretty quickly. But my guess is that they are.
And you have to pay $50 to get the card, but the card is not mandatory. You don't have to carry the card. You can just say I'm registered and show them the proof that you're registered.
And again, we come back to the basic point I keep coming back to is this is a complex substance that really needs research. There are all these unanswered questions, but because it's Schedule I, you can't get the questions answered. And of all the different substances that are in Schedule I, cannabis is the hardest one for a researcher to access. And the researchers have been complaining about this with relatively little results. And it gets even more draconian because part of the problem is not just getting access to it, but up until recently, in fact still, there's only one source of research-grade cannabis in the country. There is a farm at the University of Mississippi that grows this for research purposes. And researchers were saying this is really ridiculous. That for one thing, that farm could only produce THC cannabis plants with a THC of 12%. On the streets, people are using 20% THC. So if you want to do a research on what's on the streets, you can't go and get the street because you can't do research with a substance which is not hasn't gone through the procedures, but you literally can't get the same strength as used out there. So a group sued the DEA for this, and there's all kinds of ways to try to remedy this. There have been all kinds of laws attempted to be passed through Congress that, for the most part, have not succeeded. Somebody sued the DEA to move this out of Schedule I, or to at least create a new schedule of a 1R where people could do research. And the DEA sat on that for about 2 or 3 years. And then finally, they answered no. But they made one concession, which is, we will let some other folks grow it. And in fact, here are 6 entities that we vetted that could grow it. But the DEA itself could not approve that. It had to be approved at higher levels of the DOJ. And that has disappeared. It's up there in the vapor. Again, there's this frustrating no response. So we don't know who's holding it up, but we know that there's still only a single spot. And that not only holds up research, but it holds up pharmaceutical development as well.
Just to give a little more color on that, some folks know hallucinogens have been looked at for treatment-resistant depression. It's actually easier for my colleagues to get access to psilocybin for research than to get marijuana for research.
So this is a quick summary, and the way I put all this together is that the law has really been intransigent about this. No matter what the evidence is, they've been taking a hard line that they're not going to change the law. If you look at public opinion polls, there's been a surge of support for legalization of cannabis in some form. But there's a collision between the law not moving and all of this groundswell of support. And so the way I see it is that on a state level, these people who are wanting to get more access to it have changed the laws on a state level but can't stop it on a federal level. So that's why we as clinicians are stuck with this artisanal product, because we can't get a legitimate regulated product. So we're, again, caught in this crush, which hopefully we're going to change, but but certainly the DOJ and the Attorney General Sessions, if anything, are rolling things back from where they seem to be moving just a few years ago. So I think that's the, and I wanted to leave some time for questions.
We have about 5 minutes. We have to empty the room, at 55 or 56, because we just took this room from a different group. So if anybody has 1 or 2 questions, please go ahead and ask.
Sure, I'll help with some.
Yes.
I have 2 questions. My first question was regarding screening for people to get medical cards. Do you believe that it's too loose of a system, or that you need improvement, or do you think it's just?
I think it's ridiculous. I skipped through one of the slides where the way this starts is in California, the law was passed for medical, it became recreational, de facto, because anybody could get a card. And I know that DC, because I was involved in that, and I was involved in Maryland, they say, when they get the law passed, they say, we're going to be tight about this. We're going to be strict. Certain quick conditions have to qualify. And then once it's in place, those qualifications get loosened. And there's actually a clause in the Maryland one saying it's only good for these 4 or 5 things, but the 6th clause is anything that you think might benefit. So I think it's just completely wild. And the other part about it is that a physician prescribes a medication, they know what the dose is, and they specify the frequency, but they don't know the dose of what they're recommending. They don't really know the quality. So I think it's ridiculous, but I think it's a workaround, because I think that the law enforcement folks, the DEA, are being even more ridiculous. If you look at what the qualifications are for Schedule I, it has to be no known medical use and significant danger. And cannabis doesn't fall in with that. I mean, it's certainly less dangerous than opioids. You can get pharmaceutical cocaine out there. It's much less dangerous than that. And again, we've had millennia of evidence of its usefulness. So the fact that they can stand up there and say there's no medical use, we need more studies. But we can't get more studies because the catch-22 is this Schedule I keeps you from doing the studies you need to answer these questions. 2 questions?
That was my first question. My second question was, if they do get stricter on the screening process, and also tying into that study with the pilots, for those pilots, I was wondering, was it their first time using it? As when someone has their first drink compared to they've been drinking for years, they know what to expect.
Yeah.
So if it is screening is tightened up and employees are allowed to work with a medical card, say if they're a pilot, say, I already know the effects of it, I can control myself.
Right. I don't know the answer to that, but I don't think it's going to get tighter, because the other piece that we didn't talk about is what happens when commercialization comes in. We know what happens when commercialization comes in with alcohol or tobacco. They start pushing the envelope. And I think that they would, as the money gets into it, I think the chances of it getting tighter are highly unlikely.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you.